Honestly, I'm still just completely baffled by the sheer audacity of people who think slapping that fluorescent pink violation sticker on another human being's property is an acceptable way to say hello. It's literally the exact reason I started sovereign justice in the first place, because some folks just desperately need to be put in their place using their own ridiculous rule books. Let's just dive right into this absolute dumpster fire.
Have you ever stared directly into the Arizona sun in the middle of August? Don't. Seriously, I mean it. It hurts in a way that makes your retinas feel like they're being gently microwaved on the defrost setting. But you know what honestly hurts significantly more than temporary blindness? A $5,000 homeowners association fine for trying to keep a freak, apocalyptic monsoon from turning your living room into an indoor municipal swimming pool. My name is Jack, and I live in Scottsdale, Arizona. Specifically, I live in a beige, soul-sucking subdivision called Whispering Pines. Let me clear something up right away. There are no pines here. None. I haven't heard a single pine whisper in the 5 years I've owned this house. What we have is gravel, cacti that look like they're flipping you off, and a homeowners association board that wields more unchecked, tyrannical power than most sovereign nations. It started on a Tuesday. The sky had bruised to a deep, angry purple the night before, and the desert had unleashed one of those rare, violent monsoons that dumps 2 months' worth of rain in exactly 45 minutes. My roof, which was apparently made of stale graham crackers, and optimism by the lowest bidding contractor in 1999, decided it had had enough. At 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of water aggressively drumming onto my kitchen island. I did what any rational, panic-stricken homeowner would do. I hauled myself up into the attic, found the source of the leak, and the next morning, as soon as the sun came up and started baking the damp earth into a sauna, I climbed onto the roof. Now, I didn't have time to wait for the insurance adjuster to leisurely make his way out here. I had to protect my property. So, I took a heavy-duty woven silver tarp, the really thick industrial kind you use to cover a boat, and I secured it tightly over the damaged section of shingles using roofing nails and about 10 pounds of silicone sealant. It wasn't pretty. It was, in fact, incredibly reflective and aggressively silver against the sea of dull, mandated, desert sand shingles. But it worked. The house was dry. I figured I had a week, maybe 2, before the roofers could come out and do a proper patch job. I figured wrong. I was standing on my front lawn, wiping a mixture of sweat and roofing tar off my forehead with the back of my hand, admiring my handiwork. That's when I heard the unmistakable, was rhythmic clicking of orthotic sandals hitting the pavement. It was Brenda. Brenda was the president of the Whispering Pines HOA. She was a woman who looked like her primary diet consisted of unsweetened lemon juice and grievances. She always carried a brushed aluminum clipboard. I don't know why it had to be brushed aluminum, but it caught the glare of the sun perfectly, much like my new tarp. She marched up my driveway, stopping precisely where the concrete met the approved 2-inch layer of decorative Sedona red gravel. "Jack," she said. It wasn't a greeting. It was an accusation. "Morning, Brenda," I replied, forcing a painfully tight smile. "Quite a storm last night, huh? Caught a bit of a leak, but I got it handled." Brenda didn't look at me. She tilted her head back, her oversized, polarized sunglasses reflecting the blinding silver rectangle on my roof. She let out a sigh that sounded like a tire slowly losing air. She unclipped a pen from her clipboard. Click, click. "Jack, what is that?" she asked, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension usually reserved for explaining basic math to a toddler. It's a tarp, Brenda, to keep the water out. The roof leaked. A tarp, she repeated, tasting the word and clearly finding it offensive. A highly reflective, unauthorized, non-compliant, aesthetically disastrous tarp. It's temporary, I said, my patience already beginning to evaporate in the 95-degree morning heat. I've already filed the claim with State Farm. An adjuster is coming next Tuesday. The roofers will be here the week after. And it's just to stop the drywall from turning to mush. Brenda vigorously scribbled something on her aluminum clipboard. We don't do temporary in Whispering Pines, Jack. You signed the CC and Rs when you moved in. You are well aware of the architectural guidelines. Section 8, paragraph 4, subsection B. All roofing repairs must utilize pre-approved materials matching the existing aesthetic. Brenda, it's an emergency patch to prevent structural water damage, I argued, stepping closer. Are you telling me I should just let the rain destroy the inside of my house to maintain the aesthetic of the neighborhood? She finally looked at me, lowering her sunglasses just a fraction so I could see the absolute void of empathy in her eyes. I'm telling you that you are in violation of the community standards. That thing is an eyesore. It is reflecting sunlight directly into Mrs. Gable's sunroom across the street. You have 24 hours to remove the unapproved, highly reflective roofing material, or you will be fined. Fined? I laughed, a short, sharp bark of disbelief. You're going to fine me for mitigating a disaster? $500, she said, her voice entirely flat. $500? For a tarp? Per day, Jack. She ripped a piece of paper off her clipboard. It was a fluorescent pink carbon copy slip. $500 per day, retroactive to the moment I observed the violation, which was 10 minutes ago. Remove it by tomorrow morning. Use an approved desert sand or coyote brown temporary cover if you must, though I doubt you'll find one, or the fines will accrue. If they reach $5,000, well, we will place a lien on your property. She held the pink slip out to me. I just stared at it. I didn't take it. I'm not taking that, I said. Brenda smirked. It was a terrifying expression. She stepped past me, walked right up to my custom, mahogany front door, and peeled the backing off the sticker. She slapped the fluorescent pink violation notice directly onto the wood, pressing it down hard so the adhesive really bit into the grain. Have a compliant day, Jack, she said, turning on her orthotic heels and clicking her way back down the driveway. I stood there for a long time. The Arizona sun beat down on my neck. I looked at the pink sticker on my beautiful door. I looked at the silver tarp on my roof. And then, a very specific, very cold kind of rage settled into my chest. So the kind of rage that doesn't make you want to yell or throw things. The kind of rage that makes you want to read. I went inside, made a pot of coffee so strong it could probably strip paint, and walked into my home office. I pulled out my filing cabinet, the bottom drawer groaning as I yanked it open. I dug past the mortgage documents, past the title insurance, until I found it. The Whispering Pines covenants, conditions, and restrictions. The CC and Rs. It was a monstrous document. 412 pages of dense, legally binding micromanagement. It dictated the exact Pantone shades allowed for exterior trim. It mandated the maximum height of grass blades, 2.5 inches, strictly enforced. It had a whole chapter dedicated to the permissible fonts for mailbox numbers. It was a monument to suburban control. I cracked my knuckles. I took a sip of the bitter coffee. All right, Brenda, I muttered to the empty room. Let's see what kind of game we're playing. I started reading. I didn't skim. I read every single agonizing word. I read about the restrictions on commercial vehicles in driveways. I read about the ban on displaying flags other than the American flag, and even then, only on specific holidays. I read for 3 solid hours until the words started to blur, and my eyes felt like they were full of sand. I was looking for an emergency repair exemption. Something, anything, that gave a homeowner grace during an active insurance claim. There was nothing. Brenda was, technically, by the absolute strictest, most soulless interpretation of the text, right? Unapproved materials were forbidden. Period. I leaned back in my chair, was massaging my temples. I was about to give up. I was about to drive to Home Depot, buy some ugly brown canvas and try to staple it over the silver tarp just to appease the tyrant. But then, as I was flipping the thick packet closed, a section near the very front caught my eye. It was Article 4, Architectural Legacy. Now you have to understand the history of this subdivision. Whispering Pines wasn't originally supposed to be a basic, cookie-cutter, beige-on-beige neighborhood. The original developer back in 1988 was a guy named Arthur Vance, a visionary with more ambition than capital. He wanted to build an ultra-luxury, European-inspired enclave called the Chateau Estates at Camelback. He went bankrupt after laying the plumbing and writing the foundational bylaws. The bank seized the land. Aham sold it to a generic corporate builder in the late 90s, and they slapped down the stucco boxes we live in today. But because of a quirk in Arizona real estate law, the corporate builder inherited Vance's original foundational CC&Rs and just tacked their own rules onto the end of them. I started reading Article 4, Section 3, titled Roofing Materials and Architectural Excellence. The text read, "To maintain the intended prestige and historical authenticity of the Chateau Estates, all primary structures shall utilize roofing materials of the highest caliber. While subsequent amendments may allow for standard asphalt shingling in approved desert pallets, see Addendum B, all property owners retain the permanent vested right, without requirement of further Architectural Review Board approval, to utilize premium, historical legacy materials. These legacy materials are exclusively defined as natural slate tile, imported Spanish terracotta, or natural unpainted Class A standing seam copper." I stopped breathing. I read it again. And then I read it a third time. Permanent, vested right, without requirement of further Architectural Review Board approval, natural unpainted Class A standing seam copper. A slow, terrifying grin spread across my face. I looked out my window at the blazing, unforgiving Arizona sun. I thought about Brenda. I thought about her complaint that my little silver tarp was highly reflective, solid copper, unpainted, in a state that gets 300 days of uninterrupted, brutal sunlight a year. I practically leaped out of my chair. I grabbed my laptop and frantically started researching Arizona HOA laws. Because it's one thing to have a weird old rule in the book. It's another to actually enforce it against a modern, hostile HOA board. I needed to know if they could just vote to change the rule once they realized what I was doing. It took me another hour of digging through the Arizona revised statutes, specifically Title 33, Chapter 16, which governs planned communities. And what I found made me laugh out loud in my empty house. Arizona law is incredibly strict about HOAs retroactively changing founding architectural blueprints. Because Arthur Vance had coded the legacy materials as a permanent vested right in the original declaration rather than a standard aesthetic guideline, stripping that right away wasn't a simple board vote. According to state law, to remove a foundational vested property right from a master deed, the HOA wouldn't just need a majority. They would need a 100% unanimous vote from every single homeowner in the entire subdivision. All 240 houses. including mine. I was bulletproof. The loophole wasn't just open, it was a massive, legally protected highway of malicious compliance. Brenda wanted to fine me $500 a day for a reflective tarp? Fine. I would give her a roof so reflective it would be visible from the International Space Station. I would turn my house into a 3,000 square foot solar oven. I immediately drafted an email to the HOA management company, copying Brenda's official board address. I kept it brutally formal and legally precise. Dear Whispering Pines OA Board, on enclosed is a certified check for $500 to cover the initial fine assessed on Tuesday the 14th regarding the temporary tarp on my roof. Please consider this formal, written notification that I will be permanently resolving the roofing issue. In accordance with my permanent vested rights outlined in Article 4, Section 3 of the Founding Covenants, Conditions and Restrictions, I am bypassing the Architectural Review Board and proceeding immediately with the installation of a pre-approved historical legacy material. Specifically, I will be re-roofing my entire property in natural, unpainted Class A standing seam copper. Construction will commence as soon as materials are secured. Have a compliant day. Sincerely, Jack. I hit send. I felt a rush of adrenaline that was entirely inappropriate for a Tuesday afternoon. The trap was set. Now, I just needed to find a contractor crazy enough to actually build the thing. Finding someone to install a solid copper roof in the middle of the desert is like trying to find a vegan butcher. It makes no logistical sense. Over the next 3 days, I called every roofing company within a 50-mile radius. Most of the conversations went exactly the same way. "You want what?" the voice on the other end of the line would ask, usually accompanied by the sound of heavy machinery in the background. "Standing seam copper," I would repeat patiently. "The whole roof, unpainted." "Buddy, do you know how much copper costs right now? It's like $15 a square foot just for the raw material. Plus, it's a specialty install. And you live in Scottsdale? Oh, it's going to look like a giant penny sitting in the sun." "I am aware of the aesthetics," I would say. "Are you interested in the job or not?" Usually they'd laugh, tell me I was out of my mind, and hang up. A few gave me go-away quotes, numbers so astronomically high they assumed I'd just politely decline. I was beginning to think my grand plan of sovereign justice was going to die on the vine due to a lack of skilled labor. Then, on Thursday afternoon, I called a place listed in the absolute back pages of the local directory, Iron and Ore Custom Exteriors. The phone rang 7 times before someone picked up. "Yeah, talk." The voice was gruff, gravelly, and sounded like the guy smoked 2 packs of cigarettes while gargling whiskey. "Hi, I'm looking to get a quote on a residential roof replacement. Standing seam copper, entire property, unpainted." There was a long pause on the line. I heard the hiss of a welding torch shut off. "Who is this?" the voice demanded. "My name is Jack. I live in Whispering Pines." Another pause. Then a low, rumbling chuckle. "You live in one of those beige HOA prisons, and you want to drop a copper lid on it? You're either a billionaire or you really, really hate your neighbors." "Let's just say I have a deep appreciation for historical legacy materials," I said smoothly. "I'm Mike," the guy said. "People call me Mad Mike. I don't do shingles. I don't do foam. I work metal. I'll be there in an hour. Don't waste my time." 55 minutes later, a heavily modified matte black Ford F350 with a custom welding rig in the bed violently hopped the curb of my driveway and parked half on the concrete, half on my HOA-approved decorative gravel. What a man stepped out. Mad Mike was exactly what he sounded like. He was built like a fire hydrant, wore a heavy canvas work shirt despite the heat, and had a beard that looked like it contained a family of aggressive badgers. He didn't carry a clipboard. He carried a battered metal tape measure. He didn't bother knocking. He just walked right up to me as I stood on the porch. He took one look at the silver tarp on the roof, then looked down the street at the rows of identical, lifeless houses. "You're going to get sued into the Stone Age, kid," Mike said, his voice a low grumble. "Actually, I'm fully compliant," I said, holding out a printed copy of the C, and Rs. I had highlighted Article 4, Section 3, in bright yellow. Mike took the paper. He pulled a pair of grease-stained reading glasses from his shirt pocket, shoved them onto his face, and read the highlighted text. I watched his eyes scan back and forth. I saw the exact moment it clicked in his brain. He slowly lowered the paper. He looked at me. He looked at the paper again. And then Mad Mike threw his head back and let out a laugh that echoed down the quiet suburban street. It was a loud, booming, beautiful sound. "Unpainted Class A standing seam copper," Mike read aloud, wiping a tear from his eye. "Permanent vested right. Oh, buddy, oh, this is a work of art. Whoever wrote this was a lunatic, and I love them." "So you'll do it?" Mike got serious, tapping the paper. "Let me tell you something about natural, unpainted copper, Jack. When it comes from the factory, it's not that dark, rustic brown people think of. Before it oxidizes, before it gets that green patina, fresh, an unpainted sheet copper looks exactly like a newly minted mirror. It is spectacularly reflective. In this sun, it's going to be a hazard to aviation." "I am counting on it," I said without blinking. Mike grinned, revealing a gold tooth. "You're a sick man. Let's measure this roof." For the next 2 hours, Mike scrambled all over my house, taking precise measurements, calculating pitches and angles. When he finally climbed down, he sat on the tailgate of his truck and pulled out a battered notebook. He scribbled furiously for a few minutes. "All right," Mike said, slapping the notebook shut. "I'm going to shoot it to you straight. Sourcing this much premium Class A copper right now is a nightmare. Supply chains are tight. I'm going to have to pull favors from a mill in Texas. Then we have to fabricate the pans and the seams. Plus, the labor on a custom metal job like this is brutal. And because it's a spite job, I'm charging you a premium." He wrote a number on a piece of paper and handed it to me. I looked at the number. It was substantial. It was more than a luxury car. It was dipping dangerously into my retirement savings. For a fleeting second, sanity tapped me on the shoulder. Was I really going to spend a small fortune just to legally torture a woman with a brushed aluminum clipboard? Then I looked at the front of my house. I looked at the spot on the wood where Brenda had aggressively pressed that fluorescent pink violation sticker. It had left a slightly sticky residue when I peeled it off. I pulled a pen out of my pocket and signed the bottom of Mike's estimate sheet. "I'll wire you the 50% deposit this afternoon," I said. "How fast can you get the materials here?" Mike tucked the paper into his shirt pocket. "For this kind of cash? And this level of glorious anarchy? I'll have flatbeds rolling onto this street in 10 days, but you better batten down the hatches, Jack, because when those trucks show up, the HOA is going to lose their collective minds." "Let them," I said. "I have the law on my side." Mike climbed into his truck, the engine roaring to life with an aggressive, throaty growl. He rolled down the window. "Hey, Jack?" "Yeah?" "We're going to polish the copper sheets right before we install them. I have an industrial buffer. It'll cost you an extra $1,000, but we can get it to a literal mirror finish. Technically, polishing isn't painting. It's just enhancing the natural state." I felt a tear of genuine joy prick the corner of my eye. "Mike, you are a visionary. Do it." The next 10 days were a tense, quiet waiting game. I lived under my silver tarp. The HOA management company didn't respond to my email, likely assuming my threat to install a copper roof was just an unhinged bluff. They cashed my $500 check, though. Brenda walked past my house every single morning on her power walks, glaring at the tarp, clearly keeping a mental tally of the days she assumed she'd be fining me again once the 24-hour grace period expired. She had no idea the storm that was coming. On the morning of the 10th day, the peace of Whispering Pines was shattered. At exactly 7 a.m., the legally permissible start time for residential construction, the ground literally shook. I walked out onto my porch holding a mug of coffee. Rolling down the pristine, quiet, beige street was a convoy. Two massive diesel-spewing flatbed trucks, followed by Mike's matte black F350 and a trailing box truck full of specialized metalworking equipment. The flatbeds were loaded with massive wooden crates, and peeking out from the slats of those crates was the unmistakable, blinding gleam of raw, virgin copper. Mike parked his truck, stepped out, and took a deep breath of the morning air. He was wearing a welding cap backwards and a pair of heavily tinted safety glasses. His crew, 4 guys who looked like they brawled in biker bars for cardio, jumped out of the box truck and immediately started setting up sawhorses and metal brakes on my front lawn. "Showtime, kid!" Mike yelled over the roar of the diesel engines. It didn't take long. Within 15 minutes, the air was filled with the deafening sound of circular saws cutting through timber crates and the sharp, metallic clang of copper sheets being unloaded. At 7:20 a.m., the clicking of orthotic sandals approached at a dead sprint. Brenda came power-walking around the corner, her face flushed, her clipboard practically welded to her hand. She stopped dead in her tracks at the end of my driveway, staring in absolute horror at the industrial staging ground my lawn had become. "Jack!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "What is the meaning of this? What are these industrial vehicles doing on community property?" I took a slow sip of my coffee. "Morning, Brenda. They aren't on community property. They are parked legally on the street and in my driveway. They're dropping off my roofing materials." She marched forward, dodging a heavily tattooed man carrying a 10-foot sheet of metal. She peered at the metal. As she did, the morning sun hit the copper, reflecting a beam of pure golden light directly into her eyes. She hissed and recoiled, throwing her hand up to shield her face. "What is that?" she demanded. "That is not desert sand asphalt." "No, Brenda. It's natural unpainted Class A standing seam copper, just like I informed the board 10 days ago." Her mouth opened and closed a few times, like a fish out of water. You can't do this. I'm issuing an immediate stop work order. This is an egregious violation of the architectural aesthetic. It's an eyesore. It's a hazard." Mike, who was standing near the front door, walked over. He looked down at Brenda, crossed his massive arms, and smiled. "Ma'am, we have pulled all necessary municipal permits from the city of Scottsdale. The city approved the material. Unless you have a court injunction signed by a judge, you are trespassing in an active construction zone, which is a massive liability." Brenda turned her fury onto Mike. "I am the president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. I am the authority here." "And I'm the guy holding the nail gun," Mike deadpanned. "Jack, do you want her on the property?" "Not particularly," I said. Brenda was shaking with rage. She whipped out her cell phone. "I am calling the police. You are running an illegal industrial smelting operation in a residential neighborhood. You're both going to jail." She stomped back to the edge of the property line, stabbing her finger into her phone screen. "Think the cops will shut us down?" Mike asked. or watching her. Not a chance, I replied, pulling the laminated copy of the CC and RS and my city permit out of my back pocket. I did the math. Let them come. 20 minutes later, a Scottsdale Police Department cruiser rolled slowly down the street, its lights flashing silently. Officer Martinez, a tired-looking guy in his late 30s, who looked like he had seen way too much suburban drama in his career, stepped out of the car. Brenda immediately ambushed him. She was practically vibrating, pointing frantically at my house, the trucks, and the gleaming stacks of copper. "Officer, thank God," she gasped. "You have to arrest them. They are destroying the neighborhood. They are violating HOA ordinances. They have heavy machinery and that metal is blinding." Officer Martinez put a hand up to stop her tirade. He walked slowly up my driveway, his hand resting casually on his duty belt. He looked at the massive stacks of copper. He looked at Mike's crew, who had paused their work to watch. Then he looked at me. "Morning," Martinez said, sighing heavily. "Sir, I got a call about an illegal industrial operation and a public nuisance." "Morning, officer," I said calmly, stepping forward and handing him the paperwork. "Here is the approved building permit from the city of Scottsdale, specifically authorizing the installation of a standing seam metal roof at this address. And here is a laminated copy of the HOA's founding declarations, specifically Article 4, Section 3, which grants me the permanent, vested legal right to install this exact material without board approval." Martinez took the papers. He read the city permit first. It was perfectly in order. And then he read the highlighted section of the CC and Rs. He read it twice. He slowly lowered the papers and looked at the copper. Then he looked at Brenda, who was standing behind him, looking triumphant. "Ma'am," Officer Martinez said, his voice flat. "Yes, officer? Are you going to handcuff them?" "Ma'am, this is a civil dispute regarding a contract," Martinez said, handing the papers back to me. "He has a valid city permit for the construction. The materials are entirely legal to possess and install. Being tacky, or having a dispute over a homeowners association rulebook, is not a criminal offense." "But it's blinding," Brenda protested, pointing at the glare. "Then don't look directly at it, ma'am," Martinez said smoothly. "I advise you to take this up in civil court if you feel the contract has been breached. But if you call 911 again for a non-emergency regarding legal home renovations, I will cite you for misuse of the emergency dispatch system. Do you understand?" Brenda looked like she had been struck by lightning. The color drained from her face, leaving her a pale, furious mask. She didn't say another word. She turned and marched back to her house across the street, slamming her front door so hard I heard the glass rattle from my driveway. Officer Martinez turned back to me. He looked at the house, then at the massive pile of copper. He stepped a little closer, lowering his voice. "Solid copper? In this neighborhood?" he asked. "Yep," I said. A tiny, almost imperceptible smirk tugged at the corner of the officer's mouth. He didn't say anything else. He just gave me a subtle, incredibly quick fist bump, turned around. Us got back in his cruiser and drove away. "All right, boys," Mike bellowed, clapping his hands together. "The law has spoken. Let's strip this roof and start laying pans. We've got sunshine to catch." The demolition of my old roof took a day. The installation of the copper began on day 2. And that was when the true psychological warfare began. Mike wasn't kidding about the buffing. Before a single sheet of copper was hoisted onto the roof, 2 of his guys ran industrial orbital polishers over the metal. It stripped away any dullness, any factory residue, leaving behind a surface so smooth, so flawlessly reflective, it looked like a liquid mirror forged by the gods themselves. They started on the lower pitches first. Every time they locked a seam into place, It was like adding another panel to a giant, neighborhood-destroying disco ball. By day 4, the roof was half finished, and the environmental impact was catastrophic. I sat on my front porch in a lawn chair, wearing a pair of welding goggles Mike had lent me, and simply watched the physics of malicious compliance unfold. It was 3:15 p.m. The Arizona sun was at its absolute peak, beating down from a cloudless, tyrannical blue sky. The angle of the sun hit the newly installed western pitch of my copper roof perfectly. The reflection didn't just scatter. The standing seams somehow channeled the light, acting like a massive 1,500 square foot parabolic mirror. And that mirror was aimed with devastating pinpoint accuracy directly at the house across the street. Brenda's house. I watched in absolute awe as a beam of pure, concentrated solar energy struck her property. The light hit her manicured front lawn, and instantly turning the grass a sickly shade of yellow. The beam crawled up her stucco walls, illuminating her house with the intensity of a stadium floodlight. And then, the beam hit her massive custom bay windows in the living room. Even from across the street, I could see the immediate effect. The glare bouncing off her windows was so intense it hurt to look at, even through the welding goggles. I saw a figure inside the house frantically pulling the curtains shut, but it was useless. The curtains were thin, beige linen. They glowed like a lampshade wrapped around a nuclear reactor. A few minutes later, Brenda's front door flew open. She staggered out onto her porch, wearing an oversized sun hat and holding a thermometer in her hand. She looked panicked. She pointed the thermometer at the siding of her house, looked at the reading, and shrieked. I couldn't hear her over the sound of Mike's crew hammering metal, but I could read her body language. She was being slow roasted in her own living room. The collateral damage was equally spectacular. The community clubhouse, which sat diagonally from my property, was catching the secondary glare. The community pool, usually packed with kids and tanning moms on a hot afternoon, was completely abandoned. The glare bouncing off my roof was hitting the concrete pool deck, superheating the chairs and making the water look like a boiling cauldron of liquid gold. Cars driving down the street had to slow down to a crawl. Drivers were throwing their hands up, slamming down their sun visors, completely blinded as they passed my property. It was a localized solar event. I had successfully weaponized the sun. Mike came down the ladder, wiping sweat from his forehead. He grabbed a bottle of water from the cooler and stood next to me, looking at the chaos across the street. "You know," Mike said thoughtfully, "I've built a lot of things in my life. I've built structural steel framing. I've built custom spiral staircases. But I don't think I've ever built a weapon of mass illumination before." "It's beautiful," I whispered, watching Brenda aggressively hose down her front porch in a desperate attempt to cool the concrete. "She's not going to take this lying down, Jack," Mike warned, taking a swig of water. "She's going to call lawyers. Big ones. The kind that charge $1,000 an hour and wear suits that cost more than my truck." "I know," I said, smiling behind the welding goggles. I'm counting on it." I guess I shouldn't have been surprised when the guy in the cheap suit showed up at my door. I mean, honestly, it was only a matter of time before Brenda escalated from municipal complaints to actual high-priced legal warfare. It was Friday, exactly 2 days after Mike and his crew had laid the final polished copper pan on the highest ridge of my roof. The house was a complete 3,000 square foot monument to malicious compliance, and it was literally glowing. The process server was sweating profusely, squinting through a pair of cheap gas station aviators as he navigated my driveway, actively trying to avoid the death rays bouncing off my gutters. "Jack?" he asked, thrusting a thick manila envelope at my chest. "You've been served," He didn't wait for a reply. He just turned and basically jogged back to his Honda Civic, eager to escape the localized solar flare I called a home. I took the envelope inside, grabbed a cold beer from the fridge, and sat down at my kitchen island. Like I literally couldn't wait to see what they came up with. I ripped it open. Inside was a cease and desist letter, printed on paper so thick and watermarked it probably cost more than my first car. It was from Kensington, Sterling and Vance, a law firm that sounded less like attorneys and more like a boutique hedge fund. The letter was a masterpiece of legal intimidation. It used words like egregious, unprecedented nuisance, and immediate equitable relief. Attached to the back of it was a formal summons. At the Whispering Pines, HOA Board of Directors was calling an emergency town hall meeting for that very evening at 7 p.m. in the community clubhouse. The agenda had exactly one item: emergency injunction and compelled remediation of 4221 Mockingbird Lane. That was me. They were going to try and pass a binding neighborhood resolution to force me to rip down the copper, or at the very least, paint it some atrocious shade of HOA approved beige. I just laughed. I mean, they were so predictable. They thought they could bully me with letterhead and a community vote. They had absolutely no idea the kind of legal landmine they were about to step on. I finished my beer, went to my home office, and printed out exactly 50 copies of Arizona Revised Statutes, Section 33-1808. I put them in a neat little stack, grabbed my sunglasses, and waited for the sun to go down. At 6:45 p.m., I walked over to the community clubhouse. Honestly, the atmosphere was like something out of a post-apocalyptic movie. The clubhouse was situated perfectly in the crosshairs of my western roof pitch. Even though the sun was beginning to set, the residual heat radiating off the clubhouse stucco was intense. The building's air conditioning unit was rattling violently, fighting a losing battle against the thermal overload my roof had inflicted upon it all afternoon. I walked through the double glass doors and was immediately hit by a wall of humid, angry air. The room was packed. I'm talking standing room only. At least 100 of my neighbors were crammed into the folding chairs, fanning themselves with the emergency agenda printouts. And the best part? And almost every single one of them was wearing sunglasses indoors. It looked like a support group for retired blues musicians. At the front of the room, sitting behind a folding table like a tribunal of petty dictators, was the HOA board. Brenda was in the center. She looked like she hadn't slept in a week. Her skin was flushed, and she was aggressively glaring at the entrance, waiting for me. Sitting next to her was a guy who I instantly knew was the lawyer from Kensington, Sterling and Vance. He was wearing a bespoke navy suit that was entirely inappropriate for a 95-degree Arizona evening, his hair slicked back with an alarming amount of gel. When I walked in, the entire room went dead silent. Like you could hear the AC compressor wheezing. Heads turned. A few people muttered under their breath. I just smiled, gave a little wave, and took a seat in the back row, right next to Mrs. Gable, the sweet old lady whose sunroom I had accidentally flash-banged. "Sorry about the glare, Mrs. Gable," I whispered. She just chuckled, adjusting her oversized Chanel shades. "Oh, hush, Jack. It's the most excitement we've had around here since the great mailbox vandalism of 2018. Brenda's been losing her mind, and I am entirely here for it." Brenda slammed a wooden gavel down on the folding table. Bang. Bang. "This emergency meeting of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association is now called to order," she barked into a microphone that was feeding back terribly. "We are here to address the abomination at 4221 Mockingbird Lane. I yield the floor to our legal counsel, Mr. Sterling. Mr. Sterling stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He had that smooth and condescending voice that immediately makes you want to punch a wall. He paced back and forth in front of the crowd, making intense eye contact with the sweaty neighbors. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sterling began, projecting his voice, "we live in a civilized society. We buy into communities like Whispering Pines because we value harmony. We value aesthetic consistency. We value our property values." He paused for dramatic effect. "What the homeowner at 4221 Mockingbird Lane has done is not just a violation of taste. It is an act of hostility." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Sterling pointed a manicured finger directly at me. "He has installed an unauthorized, unpainted metal structure that operates as a blinding hazard. It is raising the ambient temperature of adjacent properties. Yes, it is a textbook definition of a public nuisance. Tonight, the board is proposing an emergency injunction. We are voting to mandate that this roof be removed or painted an approved color within 48 hours at the homeowner's expense. If he fails to comply, the HOA will contract the work themselves and place a lien on his property to recover the costs." Brenda looked at me with a smug, triumphant grin. She thought she had won. She thought the fancy lawyer had terrified me into submission. "Are there any comments from the floor before we proceed to the vote?" Sterling asked, clearly expecting silence. I stood up. "Yeah, I have a comment." I walked slowly down the center aisle, holding my neat little stack of papers. The neighbors watched me like I was walking to the gallows. I stopped right in front of the board's table. I leaned over and handed a copy of my printout directly to Mr. Sterling. Then I handed one to Brenda. "I guess you guys didn't read the founding declarations very carefully, did you?" I said, my voice conversational, completely unbothered by the hostility in the room. Sterling glanced at the paper. "Mr. Jack, we are well aware of your attempt to use Article 4 regarding legacy materials. However, a loophole does not supersede the community's right to protect itself from a statutory nuisance. The board has the authority to amend the aesthetic guidelines to prevent this kind of gross negligence." "Actually, Mr. Sterling, they don't," I said, turning to face the crowd. "And honestly, if you're charging these good people $1,000 an hour, you really should have done your homework on Arizona property law." I pointed at the paper in his hand. "Let's read together, shall we? You guys are trying to pass a new rule tonight to force me to paint or remove a material that was explicitly, permanently pre-approved by the original developer. But what you're holding right there is Arizona Revised Statutes Section 33-1808. I looked at Brenda. Her smug expression was beginning to crack. "State law is very, very clear on this," I continued, projecting my voice so the people in the back could hear. "Because the original 1988 CC&Rs categorized natural, unpainted copper not just as a suggestion, but as a permanent vested architectural right for every single homeowner in this subdivision, the HOA board cannot simply vote to take it away. Memases, you can't just pass an emergency injunction to override a foundational property right." Sterling's eyes were darting back and forth across the legal statute I had handed him. I could see a bead of sweat form on his perfectly gelled hairline. "To legally strip a homeowner of a vested architectural right," I said, leaning closer to the microphone on their table, "you don't need a board majority. You don't even need a 2/3 community vote. According to Arizona state law, to amend a foundational declaration of this nature, you require a 100% unanimous vote in the affirmative from every single property owner in the subdivision." The room went dead quiet again. "Every single owner," I repeated, letting the words hang in the hot, stagnant air. I looked at Sterling. "Tell them, counselor. Tell the board if I'm lying." Sterling swallowed hard. He looked at Brenda. He looked back at the paper. The statute does require unanimous consent for the revocation of explicitly vested development rights, he mumbled, his confident, booming voice completely gone. Brenda snatched the paper from him. What are you saying? You said we could force him to paint it. I was unaware the material was codified as a vested right in the original 1988 charter, Sterling stammered, frantically packing his expensive leather briefcase. I assumed it was a standard architectural guideline. This changes our legal footing entirely. It means you're powerless, Brenda, I said, smiling so wide my cheeks hurt. You want to force me to paint my roof? Fine, call the vote. I turned back to face the crowd of my neighbors, as they were staring at me in stunned silence. I'll save you all some time, I announced loudly. As a homeowner in the Whispering Pines subdivision, I formally cast my vote as a no. I turned back to the board. There's your lack of unanimity. The motion fails. The injunction is dead. My roof stays exactly as it is, natural, unpainted, and legally untouchable. The absolute meltdown that followed was, honestly, the most beautiful thing I have ever witnessed. Brenda completely lost her composure. She slammed the gavel down so hard the head flew off and skittered across the linoleum floor. She started screaming at the lawyer, demanding he do something, demanding he find another loophole. Sterling just grabbed his briefcase and literally speed-walked out the side door, abandoning his client rather than fighting a legally unwinnable battle against state property laws. The neighbors erupted. Half of them were yelling at Brenda for wasting HOA funds on a useless lawyer, and the other half were laughing in pure disbelief at the sheer audacity of the situation. I just walked back up the aisle, gave Mrs. Gable a little wink, and walked out the front doors into the warm Arizona night. The aftermath was exactly as satisfying as I had hoped. The very next morning, Mike's crew came by to do the final inspection and pack up their gear. You're a legend, kid, Mike said, shaking my hand through the window of his F350. I heard about the town hall. You broke the board. Just doing my civic duty, Mike, I laughed. Brenda didn't come out of her house for 3 days. When she finally did, she was immediately ambushed by angry neighbors demanding an audit of the HOA's legal expenditures. A week later, a sharply worded letter arrived in my mailbox from a different, significantly cheaper law firm, formally withdrawing the $5,000 in accumulated fines and dropping all threats of a lien. But I wasn't quite finished. I mean, they had dragged me into a legal dispute, right? I immediately filed a counterclaim in small claims court, invoking a provision in the state property code that forces the HOA to reimburse a homeowner's legal and administrative fees if the homeowner successfully defends their property rights against an unwarranted board action. I didn't have a lawyer, but I charged them for the hours I spent researching the statute, the cost of the certified mail, and the printing fees for the 50 copies of the law I handed out at the meeting. It wasn't a ton of money, but when the HOA was legally forced to cut me a check for $342.50, I took that check, framed it, and hung it right in my front entryway. Brenda resigned as HOA president a month later. Rumor has it her husband forced her to step down because the glare from my roof was making their master bedroom entirely uninhabitable between the hours of 2 p.m. and 5 p.m., and she was spending all her time obsessing over how to defeat me. The new board president was a laid-back guy named Dave, who mostly just wanted to make sure the community pool stayed clean. Dave and I had an unspoken agreement. He ignored my roof, and I didn't aggressively audit the HOA budget. Now, here is the scientific reality of what I did. And honestly, it's the punchline to this entire massive joke. People who don't work with metal don't understand how copper actually behaves. When Mike's crew polished those panels and installed them, they were essentially a 3,000 square foot mirror. For the first 6 months, my house was an absolute menace to the visual landscape of Scottsdale. I was blinding delivery drivers, I was baking Brenda's lawn, and I was reflecting so much thermal energy that my own electric bill for air conditioning actually went down because the sun was being aggressively bounced away from my attic. But copper is a reactive metal. It doesn't stay shiny forever. The moment it's exposed to the atmosphere, to the oxygen, to the occasional rainstorm, and the intense UV radiation of the desert, it begins to oxidize. It's a slow, fascinating process. By month 7, and the blinding gold mirror finish started to dull. It deepened into a rich, dark bronze. By month 10, it looked like a giant, heavily weathered penny. It stopped reflecting the sun like a weapon, and instead started absorbing it, giving the house this incredibly elegant, historic look that completely clashed with the cheap stucco, but in a way that I absolutely loved. And eventually, over the next few years, that dark bronze will continue to react with the environment. It will start to streak. It will develop that iconic, powdery green patina, the exact same chemical reaction that gives the Statue of Liberty her color. So, in the end, the HOA didn't just fail to stop me. They are legally forced to watch my roof slowly transform into a majestic, a blue-green architectural masterpiece that will outlast every single one of their cheap asphalt shingle roofs by at least a century. I got my emergency repair. I got to utilize a beautiful premium material. And most importantly, I got to use the very rulebook designed to control me as the ultimate weapon of mass compliance. I guess the moral of the story is this. Never assume the person you're trying to bully hasn't read the fine print. And if they slap a fluorescent pink sticker on your door, you don't just get mad. You get shiny. Stay legally petty, my friends.